In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about quoting and paraphrasing, and I'm going to start by using the source that comes from the Writing Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This is an excellent source to help students learn not only what quoting and paraphrasing are, but when, where, how, why to incorporate quoting and incorporating paraphrasing. It's also available as a PDF, so you could print it off if you wanted to and annotate it. So that makes it very useful. Some of the things I'm going to point out, certainly not everything on this page because you can look it up and read it for yourself. In fact, for my classes, I've usually assigned this as a reading, but the web address is here at the top of my screen. So if you want to look it up, you can. And something to think about is that sometimes students are thinking their only goal is to avoid plagiarism when they're doing things like quoting and paraphrasing. That's part of it. Plagiarizing is stealing somebody else's ideas, but it can also happen by accident. So we can not intentionally do something that would be considered plagiarism if we haven't paraphrased well, or if we've borrowed too much from one particular source. So certainly we can bring in things like quotes and we can bring in ideas through paraphrasing, but if we are really relying heavily on one single source, when we need to be using multiple sources, that could actually be a form of plagiarism. If we pull in something that is paraphrased very poorly, even with a citation in text, it still might be considered plagiarism. So something to be thinking about is not only avoiding plagiarism, but thinking about how our quotes and our quotes and paraphrases, are helping us join a larger conversation. They show our reader that we have done our work, we've done the research, we've read other ideas, and that we are able to repackage those ideas for our reader. So this is a part of our goal. So as I scroll down the page, some things to point out specifically, some things that students are not quite sure about, the difference between common knowledge and something that is maybe field specific or really needs to be pointed to as coming from a source. One way to start thinking about this, especially early on in your academic career, is if it's factual stuff that's in the public domain, like a birth date, a death date, particularly things about, here it says well-known figures, but famous people, celebrities, stuff that, we can kind of find in a lot of places. That's considered common knowledge. But where it also comes in handy for you to think about this is here we have multiple standard reference works. So if we're seeing the same information show up in 5, 6, 7 different sources, and it doesn't seem to be cited specifically in those sources, there's a good chance that that's common knowledge. But as you learn what is common and what isn't, as you do the research yourself, it doesn't hurt to cite it anyway. So if you're concerned, go ahead and put in a citation. You're not going to be wrong. When we come down to this idea of field specific, that's common within a discipline, a field, a specialty. So for example, I know what is considered common knowledge in my discipline, which is rhetoric and composition, but I would not expect a student to know that because the knowledge is very specific to my discipline, to my profession. So I know what is considered common among other people who know and practice what I do, but I also know that that is not common outside of the field. So as you become more developed in your own discipline, in your own field, you'll start to learn these things as well. Again, you as a student, you're not wrong to cite anyway. In fact, we see it right here. When in doubt, just, be cautious. Go ahead and cite it. All right, so moving down. Some of the core differences between paraphrasing and quoting are that, let's start with paraphrasing. It's essentially putting in ideas that belong to somebody else, but you have reframed them or repackaged them so it sounds more like you. It still needs a citation in text and works cited, but it is not looking like the original source. So it needs to be very different from the original source, A quote is directly word for word. And so what this resource tells us is, should I do it? What should I do? Should I paraphrase or should I quote? And I'll say this in other places. I'm going to highlight it here for our video. Only use a quote if you have a really good reason. In other words, be sparing Be selective, be strategic when you're using a quote. It should have a very specific purpose. So when your reader reads it, it stands out. They need to remember it, or you need to make sure that that idea sticks with the person who said it. You don't want to be accused, or you don't want to be associated with those thoughts. So make sure that it's quoted along with the name of the person who said it. But most of the time, especially for academic writing, we should be paraphrasing more often than we quote. So below we say when should we? So in a research paper, these are some reasons or reasons to quote, or occasions when you would quote. So again, showing authority. Again, you want the words to go with the person that said it. Their authority is helping to make it significant. You're presenting something that you're going to critique. So you need to have the original words so that you can critique them or write a comment about it. You can respond. So having the exact quote can help you do that so that you can respond to it. If there's something that is like really powerful, that there's no way you could say that any better, like that is just significant, then use it as a quote. Similar to that, if there's something historically, in this case it says historically significant. So if we're talking about, let's say Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream, we're not going to paraphrase that. Or John F. Kennedy's statement, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. We wouldn't want to change that. There's a history to it. It's already a moving statement, but it is historically significant. So we would keep that quote as is. And then there's other reasons to, if you're going to really lose meaning in a big way, if you paraphrase it, then quote it. All right. So again, there's lots of stuff here for you to take a look at on this source. What I really want to draw our attention to, though, is scrolling down the page. There are strategies here. Whoops, let me go back up a little bit in terms of how to paraphrase. So changing the structure, starting a different idea. You change the words. So let me back up. The change of the structure means you're shifting the way the paragraphs and the sentences are put together. So if the sentence begins with this idea of children of the poor at the turn of the century, a way to paraphrase that may be to start with a different idea, such as mothers and other parents who had children something, right? So that's changing the structure. Certainly changing the words. So we have a word like poor. What are some other words we could use there? Things like poverty or low socioeconomic status, something like that. But you should be changing the words along with changing the structure. So if you just go in and say, children in poverty at the turn of the century received a few mothering, so if you're only changing a couple of words here and there, that's not good paraphrasing. That's still looking too close to the original source. So there are recommendations in here, but my other recommendation is that instead of trying to change the wording as you look at it, read it, get a sense of what it says, and then put it out of your view so that you're not looking directly at it, and see if you can put it into your own words. So if we, again, looking at the source, look below. There's a section here that's on successful versus unsuccessful paraphrasing. And what I like about this particular source is that it shows the passage as it originally is. So here we have that. And then it shows us word for word. So this is clear plagiarism, example. And then they explain it. But what they also show us, and this is what I think is particularly useful to students, is that they point out what's referred to as patchwork paraphrasing. So here's where some of it has been changed. It doesn't look exactly the same. So we have a little bit of change in the structure. Here, the first example, it starts with critical care nurses, and the change has started with a person's name and the date, and then a description. However, there's a lot of this text that looks very much like the original, and they've underlined that, and then there's an explanation below as to why that is still considered plagiarism. So this is what happens often by accident. And this is why I want to point out to students that you as the writer should have a bit more command and control. Use the tools available to you, get some help, to try to figure out what else needs to be changed. How else can I paraphrase so that it's better? because this is often, again, this is accidental. A lot of times students are not quite sure that they've done this, or they're not aware that this is what is really truly considered plagiarism. So if we look below, we also have an example here of what is considered legitimate, or what is a really good example of a paraphrase that does not do the other thing. Certainly doesn't do patchwork, and it doesn't do a word for word. And then a further example as to why that is a good paraphrase. So really take a look at this source to help you out. So what I've done is, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I want to look at this, sorry. In an example, this is something that I put together, and it even says right here, I am knowingly cutting and pasting ideas from other sources in part so that I could use this as a demonstration, and also so I could test out Unicheck, the plagiarism checker tool. So here we have in this paragraph, the one that starts with the artist Carrie Mae Weems. Here is, I'm going to go right down here to the citation. This is the original text. It comes exactly word for word out of this source. And I'm going to talk here in a second about the citation that's there. This comes word for word out of the source. So not only is that just cut and pasted right in, and it's not done well, it doesn't really make any sense why it would be done that way, but it's quoting other quotes. It doesn't need to be quoted directly. A lot of this could be paraphrased, it could be shortened, etc. And so what I've done is I've put a example below. In fact, let me I will give us a little bit of space here before my video runs out. So first of all, this is not how we do an in-text citation, but in a draft, that's okay because it reminds you of where it comes from. But in a final revised version, that is not what the citation should look like. If we take a look at my paraphrase, actually what I have here is a combination of a paraphrase and a short quote. So what I've done is I've changed the language from this direct one, the artist Carrie Mae Weems, sat at her desk in 2014. And so I've slightly changed the structure, but where I've changed it more so and put in other words that are not in that passage that we see above is when I've changed the rest of the wording in that sentence. In fact, these ideas are coming from the article that I took that original passage from. So if I go back in as a writer and see, okay, well, what really was being said here? What am I trying to convey? And why do I want to bring that information into my own work? If I go back to the original source, I may get a better sense of what it was about. And so what I've done here in my example is took a look at the original source, realized that the ideas I want to convey had more to do with ideas in following paragraphs than the thing that I put here originally. And so I was able to write the paraphrase. What I've then done is I thought that this was an important quote to include, that Carrie Mae Weems was talking about how valuable this grant was to her. And so it let her continue her work. What I've done is I've added a few words, such as on her art, because that's what she's implying. That's what she's talking about in the whole piece. So I've been able to kind of take those words and add them into her quote because that's really what she means. And the same is true here at the end of that with the pressures not to work on her art. Because again, what she's talking about in this article is she felt a lot of pressure to stop doing art and she didn't have enough money, etc., etc. So the grant let her continue making her art, even though she felt like there were many reasons not to do it. What we see then at the end of this is the citation. So this is a parenthetical. This is an in-text citation. Because I've used part of her ideas that I've quoted directly out of another source. I've said, this is an indirect quote, by the way, QTD quoted in Pogrebin. So Pogrebin is the original author of the article that I was borrowing, and that's what we have here. So here's the original source. Here's the author's name. And what I've done is I've taken an indirect quote. So Weems is quoted in this source. I've borrowed the quote from the source to quote in my own, so that's what's referred to as an indirect quote. But then instead of mentioning the author of the article in this sentence, because I really want it to be about Carrie Mae Weems, I'm using a parenthetical citation to reference the author, but also to indicate that I have done an indirect quote. So again, here's an example of something that is plagiarized. It's been cut and pasted in. That's not acceptable. It's bad academics. It's bad ethics. And then the revision.